Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade U.S. History class. The title of this lecture is America, a World Power, Expansionism and Imperialism, kind of an introduction to those terms and concepts. We're going to be looking at the time period kind of following the Civil War from 1867 to 1919, when America was looking at expanding globally. The textbook readings for this particular video lecture comes to us from these two sections: the United States Gains Overseas Territories, page 692, and a section in the Spanish-American War on page 700. Our guiding questions in this lecture are: what were the reasons behind the U.S. expanding globally? What were the purpose behind the Great White Fleet? Who were the expansionists? What did they want to accomplish? What is imperialism? And then who were the anti-expansionists, and why were they against U.S. expansion? If we think about America today, we are truly seen as kind of a world global power. If we look at a map that shows our diplomatic relations with countries around the world, we can see here that there's blue here, the United States. Everything that is in green is countries that we have diplomatic relations with. We have generally on friendly terms relations with those countries. And as we can see, it's pretty much the entire globe. There's a few places that we have conflicts with, like Syria and Iran and North Korea. But generally speaking, we have pretty peaceful relations with a lot of different countries globally. We don't just deal with our own internal politics, but we also are involved in discussions that are in more of a global nature. If we also look at our military presence globally today, every section that's in red represents countries that include U.S. military bases or U.S. military sites. And as you can see here, there are actually quite a few places around the world, not just in North America and the United States, but also places in South America and places in Europe, places in the Middle East, places in Asia and South Asia have a strong military presence. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, well, how did America get to this point of being such a large global presence, both through our military strength, but also through our diplomatic relations with countries around the globe? And really, that story begins after the American Civil War. In the period after the Civil War, between 1865 and 1900, we become one of the largest industrial nations in the world. And the question is, why did we want to expand our influence to other nations, other countries? And that's what we're going to be looking at in this particular lecture, and we'll be discussing in class. So why expand? Well, there are kind of three key reasons why Americans were wishing to expand. The first one was mostly economic. The Industrial Revolution requires access to a lot of natural resources. Now, America already had a great supply of natural resources, but there's always a need and desire to have access to more raw materials for industrial might, and to also use this to open up trade with other countries. Another one is military strength. You never want to look globally as a weak nation or weak power because it might make it more likely under this theory that people might attack you. So this display of military strength was another main feature of this reason for America to expand. And then last but not least was this racial superiority belief, this idea that it was up to the Caucasians, the whites of the world, to kind of they were viewed as racially superior, to sort of civilize the uncivilized regions of South America, Africa, and Asia. Now, we watched a video in class that discussed some of these concepts, and I would encourage you, if you haven't watched the video, to make sure you watch that under the history videos on demand. So when we think about why did we want to expand globally, well, it was open up new markets and open up access to raw materials for trade internationally. We wanted to display military strength so that we weren't seen as a weak nation. And then this idea of racial superiority, that we had this kind of conception that it was up to us to bring progress and civilization to the world, especially in places like Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Were kind of the main areas where this is taking place. And this was all going on globally, too. So the United States wasn't the only country that was beginning to expand and create colonies. It was also Europe had been doing this for centuries. Another thing we talked about is the Great White Fleet. And this is a good example of that display of military strength. In December of 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt, a name we should sound familiar to us, ordered our new Navy, which was known as the Great White Fleet because of the white paint that was painted on the hulls of the ship, to really sail around the world. And this was done as a symbol of American military strength and power. And that was why this was sent around, that we were a global player, we were a global power, we had a strong military, and we were going to be equal to some of these other European nations that had also tremendous naval powers as well. So we start kind of seeing this kind of buildup of military strength and this need to colonize around the world and this need to open up markets for our growing industries and factories that were really becoming very much a large global player at this time period. The people that wanted the Americans to expand became known as the Expansionists. This is kind of like Manifest Destiny Part 2. Remember, we learned during our Westward Expansion unit that this idea that America had the destiny to expand west, right? It's manifest destiny. You can't stop it, and neither can I. Well, now that as the conflicts in the Western territories and the Plains Indian Wars are starting to kind of wind down a little bit, and as America is expanding industrial and growing industrially, you have Americans also beginning to look beyond our horizons and beyond our borders to expand our influence in the Western Hemisphere, kind of around the globe here. So it wasn't just focusing on just North America, but also Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean islands, and even pushing out even further that. And these Americans became known as expansionists. They wanted to try to expand our influence. Another term we use to describe expansionists is sometimes something called imperialism. Imperialism is based upon the root word of empire. So if you think about when you learned about empires like the Roman Empire or the Greek empires or the British Empire, this is this idea that we're going to, as a nation, form an empire by going over and gaining control over other nations globally. So we're going to have direct control over their economics, their way of doing business and the kind of industries they have, but also gaining political control over them as well. So if you think about imperialism and the expansionists, they were very much into expanding America's power and strength in a more global sense, specifically focusing on our immediate neighborhood, which would be Central America and South America and the Caribbean islands. Now, not every single American was very excited about this idea of American expansionism, and so a group known as the Anti-Expansionists, or sometimes they're referred to as the Anti-Imperialist League, were very upset with this notion of American expansionism globally. There were three key reasons why the anti-imperialists or the anti-expansionists were upset with American expansionism and imperialism. They really felt that one was that it was really a threat to our values of democracy. If we believe in democracy, that the government is ruled by the consent of the governed, that it's the government of the people, by the people, for the people, you can't be a democracy and be an empire. The two things don't really equate to each other. You can't be an empire and control and subjugate or control other people at the same time you're believing in democratic values of power of the people to represent themselves. So that was one aspect that the anti-imperialists or the anti-expansionists were upset with. There also was worry about the growing buildup of our U.S. military, and that was money that was going towards building up a large army and a large navy. There were concerns that that was just costing America too much. And there was a worry that by expanding globally into markets overseas and taking over regions and countries overseas, that industrialists, because they're always looking for the cheapest labor, would send their factories to go to those places where they could hire cheaper labor that would cost American jobs. And so there were those Americans who were very, very concerned by that as well. One of the most famous anti-imperialists is actually a Nebraska native, William Jennings Bryan, and he was once asked about this idea of American expansionism. He actually ran for president, did not win, but ran for president, and he said, "America has exerted upon the human race an influence more potent than all the other nations of the whole earth combined, and has exerted that influence without the use of the sword or the Gatling gun." So this idea that American democracy is truly what our gift is to the country, to the world, and we don't need to use military force to accomplish these endeavors. So what we'll be learning about these next couple of weeks as we learn about American expansionism during this time period after the American Civil War, we'll be focusing on a couple places. The areas that will eventually become the states of Alaska and Hawaii. We'll talk about how those territories are added. We'll discuss about a conflict that occurs with Spain that involves Cuba and the Philippines. We'll also talk about Colombia and Panama. And we'll also get to a little bit about some issues that were going on in China and a rebellion that was taking place called the Boxer Rebellion that America will be involved with other European nations as well. So this is this era of global expansionism. It is kind of Manifest Destiny Part 2, this idea that America is going to need to continue to expand its territory and its influence to beyond our borders. So thank you for listening. As always, if you have questions, please make sure you ask. Have a good day.